Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be talking about blue hybrids. So as of late, blue hybrids has been in the hot seat in terms of a topic of discussion because, well, looking at the past couple of events, it seems like blue hybrids has been a very dominating force. And I'm not saying they haven't been, because they have, considering in various other events in various regions, they have always been at least 50% or more of the top 16. So it's a very powerful deck, and this isn't necessarily a deck profile. This is just showing off right here the core or foundation of what almost every single blue hybrid deck is doing. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of tech and tools that the deck can utilize depending on the types of matchups the player is expecting to see and the types of cards the player wants to run. So it is still a semi-flexible deck in terms of what it can handle against in the current meta. And I think just between all of its tech and tools and all of its sideboard possibilities on being able to swap in and out what you need, it really does make the deck a lot more powerful than it did in Japan, even though in Japan it was kind of suppressed a little bit just because of the Susanoo threat, where they really don't have an interaction for Susanomon. When Susanomon will swing, they're just going to eat the 3 and then hope the opponent doesn't have enough memory to be able to close out the game with. But back then, in Japanese meta, they also had Mega Digimon Fusion to help facilitate that, and that led to the somewhat suppression of blue hybrids. It was still a very powerful and dominating threat, more so just because Ice Wall was a really powerful and annoying card, and the bans and restrictions did affect our format, and those bans and restrictions actually led to blue hybrids actually having a better overall place in the meta, just because there's not a whole lot that people can do to really stop what its game plan is. So its game plan is trying to take advantage of the opponent's Digimon and try to stop the opponent's actions in various different ways as well. So even though in Japan they didn't really utilize Syakomon and ModokiBetamon, they're not playing best of 3s, and we are, so we have both of those tools to not only stop the opponent from gaining memory with ModokiBetamon, but we also have the availability to stop them from reducing their evolution costs in the form of Syakomon. Then if they're trying to deal with ModokiBetamon and Syakomon, then they also have to deal with Bokomon, because Bokomon will also make our evolutions into our level 4s free, making it even easier to play a lot of our cards and do very powerful things with them. On top of the fact that this is blue, and blue has access to not only just level 3 hybrids to help go up the stage and not really lose any of their abilities, but they also have really good draw and search tools. So Strabimon is just one of the best search tools that we have, just because almost everything in the deck that we're going to be running is going to be either a tamer or a hybrid, outside of the couple of options and some various other cards to help the deck overall. Then we also have Kyaromon as a really good Digitama for this deck, just because we actually don't need to attack with our ModokiBetamon and our Syakomon, putting them at risk themselves from the opponent's abilities and the opponent's security. So Kyaromon, just the fact that we could have those Digimon sit passively on the field, attack their inheritables, and be rewarded for that, only helps facilitate the fact that we could use our level 3s in some very defensive ways, and we don't necessarily need to aggress with them, because the primary goal of our hybrids is going to be digivolving them on top of our tamers, and we have one of the best tamers in the entire game as of right now to facilitate the hybrid strategy in the form of Tommy. So not only is he just a really solid card at just wiping out the opponent's inheritable stacks, but what we're actually trying to do with Tommy is utilize his inheritable ability to constantly and repeatedly stunlock the opponent's Digimon from really doing anything, kind of locking out their field from being usable. And the fact that we keep their Digimon locked down only makes it easier for us to gain advantage off of cards like Sora and Joe, because now they don't have the availability to swing to try to get rid of their Digimon to stop us from gaining the value off of it. And a lot of the value out of the blue hybrids deck is coming from Sora and Joe, just because if we have multiple Sora and Joes out on the field, then we have multiple instances of the first ability to gain 2 memory at the start of our turn. On top of that, we could pair that up with a memory fixing tamer, being Davis as the best one because of his consistency ability, but the fact that he'll just hard set us to 3 makes playing our cards even easier, and that's kind of just what blue hybrids wants to do, is be able to play its cards as efficiently as it possibly can. Then we even have cards cards in the form of Hammer Spark to gain some instant memory, even though, yes, sometimes we are going to have to be facing off against the opponent's memory blockers. It doesn't stop the fact that Hammer Spark is just a really good card to try to make some very powerful plays with out of nowhere. Similar to how we could just set up a Howling Memory boost to continue the stun lock, continue the attacking the inheritables, and then the delay ability to gain some instant memory later just makes it a very powerful card to be using for the deck to just help facilitate everything that it wants to be doing. And to round things off, even though Ice Wall did get limited to 1, it's still just a very powerful option card that we want to be using regardless because of how strong it actually is to buy us an extra turn to figure out a way to aggress onto the opponent and really stop some of their actions in their tracks because of what this card is doing to basically tax all of their attacks from any of their Digimon coming from anywhere. And then as far as replaying our Digimon, we even have cards like Beowulfmon to also act as a really good aggressive tool to just easily go all the way up into him, swing with him, and then not only just control the opponent's field by bouncing one of their lower level Digimon back to their hand, but it's also adding an inheritable source, mainly going to be one of our level 4 hybrids, back to our hand. So that way we have another level 4 that we could be reusing for its various abilities and to try to line up with our tamers to have constant and consistent pressure. And the cards that we want to take advantage of is going to be Korikakumon, because he has interaction with Tommy to try to stunlock the opponent's Digimon, but if we need to use him on top of another level 4 or on top of our Strabimon, then we also have those options available to us as well, making him a very well-rounded hybrid for us to be using to try to stunlock the opponent's Digimon. And to help with more source removal to kind of round out everything that the deck is trying to do, we have a Kumamon, which is going to basically be the Lobomon, but better. So in the previous formats past, we were just using the BT4 Lobomon because, well, that's just the only one we had, and now that we have basically the same thing, but with an upside of an ability, with a trade-off of only being minus 1000 DP, it's still just a no-brainer to want to run Kumamon for that upside alone. Just because, well, we could pair this up with Kyaromon, we could Digivolve him on top of one of our level 3s without really losing any tempo, so we just have lots of different ways to even just play Kumamon, and we have even more benefit and reason to play Kumamon, making this package just a very powerful force to be reckoned with for most decks, just because, well, in hybrids, you're not necessarily going to be leaving a whole lot of Digimon in play, let alone the Digimon you're going to be aggressing with, and you're mostly just going to be trying to set up some really solid tempo plays to just hard play your tamers, pass the turn over to the opponent, wait for them to basically make the first move, and then capitalize on them because they made the first move, and it's basically like a pseudo game of chicken, but a little bit more complicated than just waiting for the raising area to be fully stacked and your raising area to be fully stacked, just because of the higher usability and the amount of different ways we have to be able to play our cards. And then, as I stated before, this isn't even including any of the other cards that you could think about including inside of the deck to really customize it and make it your own, depending on what you feel like the matchups are in the given meta that you're going to be playing this against. So this actually is a deck that benefits from sideboards more than some other decks and other colors, just because, well, unfortunately, not all the colors and not all decks are created equally. So blue has a plethora of different sideboard options depending on the opponent. So if you're facing off against something like yellow hybrids, then you could tech in a Zulongmon. If you're facing off against something like purple Cherubimon, then you could run Classic Collection Metal Garurumon. Like, there's just a lot of different things that could go on inside of the deck and inside of your sideboard to really tech it against various other decks in the meta, only making this deck perform even better, because something as an example like Jesmon, what are you really going to be teching in with Jesmon? Jesmon's a very one-note, one-dimensional deck where he's just going to try to stick to his game plan, and the only thing you're really going to be sideboarding in a Jesmon scenario deck is a couple of anti-meta cards like Gaussmon, and then maybe some cards to help with its overall consistency, because it does have a huge consistency issue. But that deck specifically aside, it's just an example to show that not all decks have equal access to very powerful tools to handle different decks in the meta. And then on top of that, we all probably misguessed what the Boogeyman deck of the format is going to be. Usually in a given format, there's going to be one deck that everyone is going to be afraid of, and then they're going to start teching and building their deck against that. So early on, we saw that everyone was going to be the most afraid of yellow hybrids. well, sometimes when you try to prep and prepare for yellow hybrids, that leaves you a little bit more vulnerable and open to something like blue hybrids to come in and start steamrolling just because of, well, the difference on how you have to play against each of those decks. So against yellow hybrids, you'd be more aggressive where you want to move out faster just because you want to try to swing and deal as much damage as quickly as you possibly can, because you know they're just going to have a huge amount of security if you don't otherwise. And that kind of game plan and gameplay only works in blue hybrids' favor because, well, they're waiting for you to make those first actions, and you're only helping feed their own game plan by playing into that. So part of the reason why blue hybrids was doing so well was the fact that everyone was afraid and prepared for the wrong deck, and it only helped propel this type of a deck forward. On top of the fact that yellow hybrids also did it itself no favors because of how yellow hybrids wants to play, being a slow control grind style deck. So because in long form events, the more games you're going to have to play, the higher chance you're going to see a yellow hybrid end up drawing at some point. And once a yellow hybrid deck ends up drawing or tying, then that's kind of it for the yellow hybrid deck, and it puts itself in its own little sub bracket. And blue hybrids, as an example of a deck going through the event, will have a easier time not seeing yellow hybrids because it put itself into its own little sub bracket thanks to that one draw or one tie. And this problem is only exacerbated the more draws and more ties that it gets because, again, it is a slower style of deck that isn't necessarily going to be playing the fastest, and games don't end very quickly. Just because it lost its big win con with Susanomon, and it doesn't necessarily have the damage or availability to be able to push for damage as quickly or efficiently as some of the other hybrid-based decks. So, do I think that Blue Hybrids is a Tier 0 deck with all of this information on the table? Well, math-wise, it looks that way, but realistically, I don't necessarily think that it's a Tier 0 deck. It's probably more Tier 0.5 or the best Tier 1 deck, just because, well, of all of the things that we just saw, and now as the meta for BT07 develops, it's up to us to figure out how to actually beat the deck now that we know that this is the deck to beat and not yellow hybrids. So usually the way metas form, at least from what I've noticed in TCGs, is the first month is that testing grounds where things will really start to cement itself and solidify itself as like what is actually the meta, followed by the second month of just the meta developing around that first month and its early results. So that's probably what's going to happen now. Unfortunately, we don't have a third month where it's just further refinement and solidification of just what the meta is. But that's okay because, you know, in about a month, the deck is going to not necessarily phase out, but there's going to be more tech and tools to be able to beat the deck. So that's kind of why I'm leaning to think that Bandai isn't going to do anything, because after this one format, the deck isn't really that much of a problem. So in BT08, as an example, you have the Jagras mechanic, and we just got the rules for the Jagras mechanic announced, and, well, you could beat the Stunlock abilities off of the Korikaku and Tommy with the Jagras mechanic to be able to essentially fuse your Digimon together, make a brand new Digimon, and then be able to swing right away with. So just that Stunlock ability off of Tommy alone is now rendered useless in the face of Jagras's. And then in BT09, as another example, we have the X-Antibody mechanic and the X-Antibody card, which is a source that, well, can't be removed by card effects. So again, Blue Hybrids is getting answers to the problem that it presented, and it did present a very sizable problem for a lot of players to be playing against just because of how the deck is functioning as a whole. So with all that said and all the information we have on the table, do I think Bandai is going to do anything about Blue Hybrids? No, they're not. There's only 1 month left in the BT07 format before BT8 rolls around, and as I stated before, there's going to be answers in BT8 and later in BT9 to help keep Blue Hybrids in check and limit its possibilities on how powerful it could be. Right now, it is just more of a flash in the pan just for this type of a format, just because the answers aren't necessarily out yet. Now, I think Blue Hybrids is still going to be a fairly strong deck going into BT8 and a little bit less strong going into BT9, but the fact that this is more of just the problem with this format is kind of telling, and it actually does raise the question that should we be different than Japan? Kind of. So a lot of these bans and restrictions are based off of the Japanese format and the Japanese meta, and they are greatly impacting our format and our meta as well. Now, we did play around with the temporary rule change of sideboards and mulligans, so if those should actually be implemented into the game in our format and not Japanese format, then that brings the question that maybe we should have a separate ban and restriction list on top of what Bandai is doing for Japan already. So we could have the Japanese one that influences us, and then we could look even deeper into ours, and then we could have a ban and restriction in ours as well. That's not unreasonable or off the table. We could even think about implementing suspensions just because, well, if they know something is going to be problematic beforehand and lead to results like this, then they could easily say, okay, this card is suspended until the format is over, because there's no reason on banning the card because, like I stated before, the answer is going to be coming later. So this just gives Bandai the opportunity to try to take a little bit more of a proactive approach in how they want to handle the health of each individual format. Because unfortunately, Bandai is releasing sets a little bit faster than what I would have liked, so it's cutting the metas a little bit shorter, which isn't necessarily the greatest thing, but it's not the worst thing either. It's just an approach that they're trying to take in order to try to make the game as active and engaging as they can possibly do it, while trying to, do the whole business thing and make money also. So in the meantime, as we wait for Bandai to actually figure out what they're going to be doing with not only just our version of the game, but the Japanese version of the game as well, because, they do focus a lot on the Japanese side of things, and the game is based off of what the Japanese want. So that's kind of why, just as a little tangent, sealed formats aren't necessarily the greatest experience ever because the game isn't designed for that and we're just forcing it upon it. So that's not unreasonable to say that we can't force our own rules and our own restrictions upon the game per Bandai's point of view on how they want to handle our side of the game as well. So there's just a lot to think about, and I don't necessarily think that Blue Hybrids is this big insurmountable problem. We do have to do a little bit of our own due diligence and adapt and learn to be playing against it for the time being, while we wait for BT8 to roll around, and then we'll see what happens in BT8, because, sometimes player expectations and designer expectations are different from the reality that actually plays out. But for the time being, I'm going to enjoy what we have, and I'm going to wait and see on what Bandai's approach is, if they're even going to do anything different for the English version of the card game. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and down in the description below are a couple of different ways you could support me and the channel. So I do have a TCG Player affiliate link, so when you use that link to buy cards off of TCG Player, then some of that money will go to supporting me and the channel. I also do make and sell playmats over on Overcard Gamers on Facebook, so when you buy a playmat with my design, then some of that money will also go to help supporting me and the channel. And on top of all of that, I do have a Twitch account over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, so giving me a follow and a subscription also helps support me there, and I do play Digimon on top of various other games on that platform as well. So thank you everyone for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.